And I just want to start by sort of posing, of course, this question, why this exhibition? Of course, as we know, it's been 80 years since the events of November 1938, and so of course it's a timely commemoration of this historical event. But we also wanted to take a fresh look at these events, because sometimes in the historiography, sometimes in public memory of Kristallnacht, these events have faded from view because of the enormity of the crimes and the destruction of the Holocaust that came after. One of the other kind of motivating factors for this exhibition is that the library's predecessor organization, the Jewish Central Information Office, which Barbara's going to talk a little bit more about in her part of the talk, played a unique role in the days and weeks following the events of Kristallnacht. And as Barbara will discuss, we hold a unique record of testimonies that were gathered right after Kristallnacht, which you can see some examples of here in the back of the room. And so with one of the sort of general motivations of our exhibitions is to make our collections more accessible to more people. We recognize that not everybody is going to run up to the reading room and do an excessive amount of reading, although we encourage everyone to do that. And so we try to make the collections more accessible to people through our exhibitions. But we also try to incorporate the latest academic research in our exhibitions and make this more accessible to more people as well. And so with this exhibition, we wanted to retrain the lens on the lives of individuals that were destroyed or brutally interrupted by the events of Kristallnacht. And sometimes when you think of the name Kristallnacht, it refers to, of course, broken glass, which refers to the destruction of synagogues, of businesses, of private homes. And sometimes the fates of individuals, it doesn't always convey the human loss of these events and the violence perpetrated against Jewish men, women, and children. So in relation to that, from the perspective of Jewish refugees who came to Britain and, of course, their descendants, the events of Kristallnacht are a particularly significant landmark in traumatic memory. And for many, it was what prompted them to emigrate, and this is in part because the Nazis imposed this condition on men who were incarcerated after the events of Kristallnacht, that they had to emigrate in order to be released. And so when I started at the library, I began as someone who supported people who came to do family research, to do research on their families' backgrounds. And of course, because of where we are, that family background was connected to Kristallnacht. Many people told me about the early incarceration of grandfathers, fathers, uncles. And it was, I think, personally very interesting to work on an exhibition that put some of that into context. And so this is another reason we wanted to enter this story a bit through the extent of some of the memories of those whose families had endured these events, and who sometimes, but not always, passed down memories to their families. And this is also why it was important for us to have the involvement of descendants of witnesses to Kristallnacht involved in shaping this exhibition and loaning items to this exhibition. We're also going to hear from Deborah Jaffe in a bit about that experience. So just to briefly take a look at kind of the pathway of the exhibition, we begin with context. Kristallnacht was both an escalation of events that had happened before, but it was also a turning point. We look at instances sort of in this first half of the exhibition of mass arrests and violence perpetrated against Jews prior to Kristallnacht. For example, after the Anschluss in Austria, which you see depicted here in this image of a boy being forced to write graffiti on the wall. And also the political context and impetus for some of these actions. The exhibition also examines the expulsion of Jews to Sponheim and other border towns in 1938, and of course the arrest of Herschel Greenspan after he shot the German diplomat Ernst von Rath in Paris in retaliation for his parents having been caught up in this action. So we do look at some of the events leading up to Kristallnacht. Then the exhibition turns to the events themselves and tries to recreate, albeit briefly, sort of step-by-step what happened, how and when the orders were transmitted to both harness violence that had already begun in the aftermath of the shooting, and the orders to unleash widespread violence during the Munich commemoration. I'm not going to go over this in detail here because I think it's pretty well described in the exhibition. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it tonight, of course, please feel free to come back and have a look. But you might have some time after the Q&A to have a look at the panels. And what I did want to discuss in this part of my talk was just a few themes that I think amplified the discussion or the focus on men's and women's experiences during Kristallnacht, since we tried as much as possible to orient the exhibition's focus on the effects on people. So first, incarceration. In the days following the pogrom, at least 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, the camps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen. Jewish women were also temporarily arrested, but in many cases released and not sent to camps at this time. This series of photos is from a roundup in Erlangen, where women were arrested and kept in a courtyard for several hours and then made to do all kinds of menial labor and were publicly humiliated. The original order that was issued by Heydrich at this time was to arrest Jewish men of wealth and stature, and they were allegedly going to be held as some kind of ransom. But however, in practice, this was, of course, largely ignored, and men and often teenagers of all backgrounds and ages were rounded up and deported. So in this document, which you don't actually see in the exhibition, but I thought it was illustrative, it's dated 11 November 1938. I'm not sure if you can read that very well, but it's an administrative document from Buchenwald, which we hold in our copy of the International Tracing Service archive. And it indicates that more than 3,000 Jewish men had arrived to the camp on this date, on 10 November. And it also lists some 40 different localities in Germany from where the transports came. Buchenwald eventually held 13,000 men who were then released, many of whom were released by mid-1939. Testimony that the JCIO collected, and of course other documents and testimonies reveal that the men were treated brutally in the camp. Their families often had no idea where they had been taken, and sometimes they were able to smuggle messages to family. There's an example, a facsimile of this in one of the cases in the back. And this was sometimes the first that families heard of what happened to their male relatives. Images like this, of course, also attest to this. This is an image of Ludwig Neumann after he was released from Dachau. We partnered with the Jewish Museum Berlin on this exhibition to develop the script and some of the focus, and they have also generously loaned material. And this is another photograph from their collection, which shows very starkly a before and after images of a couple after Kristallnacht. Men could be released if they were able to find the proper paperwork to secure their passage to emigrate from Germany. And this was an activity actually usually left to women relatives, spouses, daughters, etc. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a second, but I also just want to point out that not all men survived this ordeal. For example, Julius Katzenstein, who was one of the Katzenstein brothers, who we talk a lot about in this exhibition, was deported, one of the Katzenstein brothers who was deported to camps. He died in Buchenwald, and this document on the on your upper right says that he allegedly died due to a lung infection. And this memo from the Buchenwald administrative records actually describes the date and time of his death. Another brother from the Katzenstein family, Friedrich Fritz, was so traumatized by his time in Buchenwald, from where, according to testimonies, he returned with severe frostbite at the end of December, that he died by suicide not long after. Their stories point to, I think, an important fact, that research actually still needs to be done to determine how many men died in camps after Kristallnacht, because we don't exactly know. and how many people died in hospital from their injuries, and how many died by suicide thereafter. And this image in the lower part has been donated by Gardner, who's also with us tonight, and shows the Katzenstein brothers and their families. And this entire family was really torn apart by these events and by the Holocaust. And we tell a bit of their story also in the first half of the exhibition. The third Katzenstein brother, Robert, who you see here with his 2 children and his wife, was sent to Dachau. He and his wife Helga he was eventually released, and he and his wife Helga and their son fled to Central America, and then he joined Kurt in England, and Kurt had come over on the Kindertransport. Kurt you see here in the middle, it's Catherine's father. It's a very interesting story because when we put out a call for documentation for the exhibition, Catherine wrote to me that she had discovered a testimony in this collection of testimonies that was related to her family. And so we have a very rare example of this testimony about an identified family, and she brought the image together to round out a picture of the testimony. We also, in the exhibition, include a kind of an unusual finding, which is that Catherine's father, Kurt, later Ken, wrote an account of Kristallnacht and his experiences as a young teenager. So you can see that in full in the exhibition and excerpted here. So as I mentioned, this family, like so many others, was very much torn apart by these events, and many of the Katzenstein family didn't survive, and we also tell their story in the exhibition. I mentioned briefly that women took on the role of finding the appropriate paperwork and proof of emigration for men to be released from the camps. They were also left to organize the packing of the family's belongings, often after other members of the family had emigrated first. And I think sometimes in my experience working with families doing family research, it was sometimes surprising to learn that men had been released from camps so early on. But if we remember that there hadn't been a decision taken yet to murder the Jews of Europe, it fits within the idea that the Nazis wanted to make a Judenrein, or a Jew-free Reich, and force them to emigrate at this time. Another donor who loaned material to the exhibition, Helen Stone, who we hope will actually be able to come back and give a longer talk. And you may not have been able to see this yet, but she has loaned this Hanukkah, which, and you actually can see it here, which survived Kristallnacht in a little village in Germany called Kammer. And the story of the Hanukkah itself is fascinating. Her mother's story is also very interesting because she was able to negotiate her father's release from a concentration camp by bringing his medals to show that he was awarded during World War I. And this helped secure his release, and she herself was able to manage to smuggle money over the border and to arrange for her parents to get out. So I think the history of Kristallnacht also points to the way that women organized their families, found paperwork, and helped enable emigration and in many cases rescue their family, all the while having experienced and witnessed brutalization themselves. And before I hand over to Barbara, who will discuss some of the aftermath of the events and our testimonies, I wanted to talk a bit about another aspect of Kristallnacht that still needs a lot more research and that our exhibition touches on, but that hasn't been fully studied, and that is sexual violence. There is, of course, evidence that this happened during the course of the public humiliation and private brutality and violence of the pogrom, but in many cases it's only outlined or suggested in the evidence. And there's an excellent book by Shirley Gilbert who talks about the Schwab family letters, and this is a very good example of how things are suggested in the letters, but it's very difficult to pull out the details of what happened. In the exhibition, we've also displayed excerpts of documents describing the conclusions of an investigation that was done for the Nazi Party Supreme Court, which were translated for the Nuremberg Trials. And I'm showing an excerpt of that here. The court reflected investigations that were carried out at the time, but which were never revealed until after the war, of alleged excesses during the pogrom. The investigation was done largely to appease various segments of the party, for example, particular district leaders or Gauleiter who were not necessarily pleased with how the pogrom was taken out or who had control over how the pogrom was carried out. And the court was essentially meant to quell any sort of public inquiry into these accusations of excess. The Nazi Party Supreme Court had been legalized in December 1933 and had jurisdiction mainly over party affairs, particularly disputes about racial purity, the racially fit members or members who were accused of having had anything to do with Jews. In this excerpt from the court's documents that we show in the back, it shows that at least 3 party members were expelled for raping Jewish women and girls. This was not because the rape was considered illegal, it was because they had committed so-called race defilement. And these men were among 30 men who were put on trial for their excesses, which included murder. There were 3 punishments given out after these investigations. They were either punished with expulsion from the party, a warning, or no punishment at all. The punishment given to the rapists was the harshest punishment, and they were expelled from the party. So I think this is just to show that it's very difficult to uncover this history because the victims' experiences were not always recorded. But we think, and we thought it was important to draw attention to this in the exhibition as one of the experiences of men, how men and women may have experienced the events of Kristallnacht differently. So with that, I will pass over to Barbara.
Thank you, Christine. So yeah, I'm just going to focus on 2 things in my remarks, one of which is on the aftermath of the events of the November pogrom or Kristallnacht, and I'm also then going to reflect a little bit on the Wiener Library's testimonies to these events. So in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, the Nazis actually felt emboldened within Germany, and there was an escalation of anti-Semitic measures. So, for example, remaining Jewish school children in schools were expelled, Jews were prevented from accessing welfare, banned from certain public spaces, and other measures. So in fact, the pogrom had the effect of increasing persecution, not just in itself, but in the aftermath as well. Perhaps most shockingly, Jews were actually ordered to pay for the damage caused by the pogrom and also to surrender any insurance monies that they might have claimed, for example, to damage to their own property. This was the so-called atonement levy, and I actually found when researching the exhibition in our collections that within the War Crimes Trial Tribunal documents we had a copy of the atonement levy order, and that's a translation that you can see on the left. And so we actually had some evidence relating to this event. So for Jews, obviously, conditions after the November pogrom deteriorated, and not just because of the pogrom in itself, which was horrific in itself for the reasons Christine has outlined, but also as new restrictions and measures came in. There was also escalating economic hardship, and this document may be a little bit hard to make out, but it comes from the Jewish community of Vienna. It's a report of the Jewish community of Vienna. It was published in or printed in early 1939, and the chart that you can see on the right hand side relates to 1938, and what it charts is the use of the Jewish soup kitchen in Vienna, and the months are at the top. And it shows an increase from the beginning of the year, but also other key points when, for example, when the Germans took over Austria in March 1938. And then also at the time of the pogrom, there is an escalating use of the soup kitchen. So that's obviously towards the end of the year. So it's just quite an interesting document for demonstrating this ever-escalating deprivation that Jews were facing, as well as other forms of persecution. So at the time of Kristallnacht, one thing that happened was that I suppose Jews in a way lost their illusions, if people still had any, about any idea that there could be a future for Jews in Austria and Germany. For Austrian Jews, perhaps this had already occurred with the German takeover, which happened in March 1938, as there was such an explosion of violence at that point that many Jews in Austria had already taken steps to try and leave. But for Jews in Germany, it became very, very clear at the time of Kristallnacht that there could not be a safe future for them and their families in Germany. And this quote kind of sums it up. So the Kristallnacht pogrom on the 10th of November 1938 forced us German Jews to realise that we had to flee Germany at once if we wanted to save our lives. And the writer of this emigrated to Britain and later the United States and Israel after Kristallnacht. And it just sort of reflects that very stark realisation that people needed to escape, they needed to leave, and urgently. Of course, that wasn't always straightforward. But to return to Ludwig Neumann, who Christine showed you a picture of before and who's seen there, Neumann had been a German businessman. By the time of Kristallnacht, his business had already been confiscated. He was arrested during the events of Kristallnacht and sent to Dachau. As Christine said, this photograph is taken on his release. So he was released on the understanding that he would emigrate, and we have a very extensive collection of documents in the collection relating to Neumann and his experiences. And you can see on the left his passport, his German passport, which showed that he had permission to leave the country, which was not always straightforward in itself, as the authorities wanted to make sure that you weren't trying to take out, for example, any wealth with you. So it wasn't actually always that straightforward to leave from the point of view of the Nazi authorities even agreeing, despite the fact they wanted to force Jews out. So Neumann did manage to obtain this permission and then eventually managed to obtain sponsorship to come to Britain. And so he came to Britain in 1939, then in 1940 was actually held by the British authorities in an internment camp as an enemy alien, but was released from internment and then served in the British Army in the Home Guard during the Second World War. So Neumann was somebody that did manage to escape after the events of Kristallnacht. However, not everybody was able to. This document doesn't feature in the exhibition, but it is a document from our collections. And it's a letter written by Berthold Meyer to a supporter in the United States. And you can see that he says that on this occasion we wish to express once more our heartfelt thanks for the affidavit you've been so extremely kind to procure on our behalf, and with which you so generously gave practical proof of your sympathy and kind readiness to assist us to enter the States. So Meyer and his wife were desperately trying to leave Britain at this stage, and this is actually one of a very large number of similar letters and applications for visas that Meyer and his wife were producing at this time. He then, if you look at the next little bit, he says, so we will hope and wait on till our longing will at last be fulfilled, and also to join our only child from whom we have been separated for such a long time. And Meyer's daughter had managed to get a place to come to Britain, but her parents had not. And ultimately, Berthold Meyer and his wife did not survive the Holocaust. So there are stories such as Neumann's of escape, but also stories of people desperately trying and not succeeding. So that's another aspect of the aftermath in Germany and for German and Austrian Jews of Kristallnacht. Just one other thing that we touch upon in the exhibition in terms of the aftermath in Germany is that in our collections we've got some anti-Nazi resistance material, particularly in the form of Communist Party hidden writing, or Tarnschriften, which attest to the existence of some resistance in Germany at the time. So we've actually got a very large collection of concealed anti-Nazi writing, mainly produced by the Communist Party, who often went to quite considerable lengths to hide the anti-Nazi writing that they were producing. So on the right-hand side, you can see a pamphlet. It says at the top something about why did Kristallnacht happen, warum der Judenpogrome. And this pamphlet actually was hidden inside a little shampoo packet so that it could be kind of safely distributed. On the left is another example of resistance, and this is actually particularly interesting if you look at the date. This was a kind of handbill that was distributed, I think it was in the Ruhr area of Germany, and it was produced on the 15th of November 1938, so just a handful of days after the events of the November pogrom. And it says, against the Judenpogrom, against Kristallnacht, for peace and for the downfall of Hitler. So that's just some interesting kind of items that we also have in the collection. So that's just a word on the situation in Germany. In terms of the reaction elsewhere, overwhelmingly, the reaction in newspapers and from politicians in other countries was of horror and condemnation. And you see here an excerpt from the New York Times, which is typical. So the scenes witnessed yesterday were scenes which no man can look upon without shame for the degradation of his species, published just a day after the second day of the November pogrom, on the 11th of November. However, in some countries, the condemnation was minimal or even non-existent, such as France and Switzerland. And the Swiss actually still continued to try and prevent all Jews from entering Switzerland. And indeed, there was no general relaxation on emigration rules, although at least 120,000 people did manage to escape to various places, including the United States on their quota system, Shanghai, which required no visas, and to Britain, which I'll explore in a moment. But just to say, in Switzerland, 3,600 Jews did manage to escape to safety because of the actions of one border official who chose to bend the rules and allow people in. He was uncovered and removed from his position after a while, but he did allow, through his actions, a number of thousands of people were rescued. In terms of Britain and the responses in Britain, our collections have quite a lot of material on this, as since 1939 we have been based in Britain, so understandably we have quite substantial collections focusing on Britain. And this is actually a pamphlet with a civilization produced in the immediate aftermath of the November pogrom and reacting in horror and condemnation to it. So in Britain there was some relaxation of the immigration regime. However, it has to be said that there had actually been a tightening of the regime earlier in the year at the time of Anschluss, that is the German takeover of Austria, when, because of an upsurge of Jewish refugees at that point, a visa regime was introduced for Germany and Austria, and so you had to apply for a visa and apply from abroad to come to Britain, and you needed a job or sponsorship of £50. But there was some relaxation of this system after the horrific events of Kristallnacht. So most famously, there was, of course, the Kindertransport. So on the 21st of November 1938, there was a debate in Parliament about Kristallnacht and calling for more refugees to be allowed into Britain. And we have a pamphlet that contains the transcript of the debate in our collections, and you can see that in one of the cases. So under pressure from some in Parliament and from Jewish community and Quaker organisations, the government actually allowed a visa waiver scheme for around 10,000 Jewish children from mainly Germany and Austria, but also from Czechoslovakia and to some extent Poland. And we have a great deal of material on this in the collections, and this item features on one of the panels in this exhibition. And this is just a small Kindertransport organisation, so it's very much a kind of voluntary sector effort. The government allowed it to happen, but they didn't finance it, they didn't organise it. And this very small organisation, the Hampstead Garden Suburb Care Committee, organised a small number of children to get sponsorship and placements in order to come. So whilst it was a visa waiver scheme, the children were still supposed to have sponsorship of £50 in order to come. And this card is particularly striking. Julius Blumenthal, who does appear to have come to Britain, it says movement 4th the 5th 1939, that implies he came to Britain. But if you look underneath his photograph, it's a bit hard to see, but it says father's profession, and then it says father in concentration camp, mother dead. So awful, vulnerable situation that he was in, and obviously his father was likely arrested and put in a concentration camp because of the events of Kristallnacht. Another aspect of something of a relaxation in the British regime after Kristallnacht that's not very much known about is the events surrounding the Kitchener camp. We feature in the exhibition the story of Werner Wiesenberg, and his daughter Claire kindly lent us documents relating to that. And he came to Britain as a refugee, released straight from a concentration camp. And Kitchener camp, which was in Kent, took refugees who were young, usually single men, straight from camps on the basis that they would come immediately and that they were trans migrants to Britain. That is, that they weren't supposed to be people who in the end would stay, but they would come to Britain for a temporary period in order to then migrate somewhere else later. And so there is on the left a letter to Werner from a refugee organisation, essentially saying to him, it's going to be really hard for us to help you find work and things like that. On the right is an image from our collections showing the Kitchener camp. It's from a kind of promotional document which tries to give a very positive sort of impression. So those were another group who did manage to escape to Britain after Kristallnacht. So I also tonight want to focus a little bit on our testimony collection, and this document is from our predecessor organisation based at the time in Amsterdam, the Jewish Central Information Office. The JCIO had been set up by Alfred Wiener, who'd fled Nazi Germany in 1933, and the JCIO worked together to gather evidence and information of the situation in Germany, and particularly of the position of Jews in Germany. And they had a network of contacts in Germany and Austria which helped them to do so. So in the immediate aftermath of the events of Kristallnacht, starting straight away on the days that Kristallnacht was happening, the JCIO, through their network of contacts, started to gather these testimonies to the events happening in Germany and Austria. So people sometimes were interviewed, sometimes members of the Jewish community of Holland had heard from contacts and they would pass information on. Some people managed to flee to Holland at the time and gave reports. Some letters were posted which ended up in the JCIO's hands. So these give a really incredible immediate picture of the situation in Germany and Austria. So at the time, our predecessor organisation took down these reports, then made transcripts of them and collated them. They also sought to distribute them, and this letter relates to that. It does say, if you notice if you can read it, you probably can't, but on the bottom paragraph it says, it's to do with somebody receiving copies of the testimonies, but it says you're at liberty to publish the reports, but it says no mention of our office being your source. So they were trying to kind of protect themselves at this time. So we've got lots of documents about how they were trying to distribute this information and use it to raise awareness as well. So the collated reports were bound into a volume and then rebound, I think, in the 1960s, and you can see that in the big square cabinet towards the back of the room. And so this is it's one of two volumes, actually. This is the original, so far as we have them, bound volume of testimonies, and they really are an amazing collection with fantastic qualities as documents and historical evidence, and they really draw out a lot of the most important features of the events of Kristallnacht. So we obviously chose to kind of make them quite a major focus in the exhibition. So this whole back section is all about the testimonies and features a number of excerpts. And if you'd like to read more afterwards, just to say you're supposed to lift them up. You don't. It's not no touching. You can have a look at them in more detail. But I just now want to draw out a few features of the testimonies. So many of the testimonies attest to the differing effects that Kristallnacht had on different groups of victims. So this one, for example, obviously focuses on the impact on some children. So this was a Jewish orphanage where children were driven out of the building and the orphanage wrecked. And that report came from the 21st of November. I should just say actually that the B, which is the numbering system for the report, so B20 in this case, B is Bericht, which is German for report, so it just means report 20. And then in report 65, it kind of highlights something that Christine mentioned to do with the differing effects depending on people's gender. So in this case, women and children and men were all kind of rounded up and arrested together, but then the women and children were actually sent home. The men were then mistreated and taken to Dachau. So in the reports there is evidence supporting the idea that the effects were different for different groups of people. One thing that really struck me when looking through the testimonies in preparing for this exhibition is the care that many of those giving testimonies were taking to be really specific in the detail that they give, really accurate and specific. There's a kind of real incredible seriousness with which they take their task. And so this is an example from the midst of Kristallnacht itself. The second report received, and it gives somebody's name, where he lived, the specifics of what had happened to him. And that's something that's quite striking about quite a number of the reports. Along with a focus in a lot of the reports on victims, there's also evidence and information about perpetrator groups as well. And the SA and the SS, along with, in some places, such as Vienna, young men in general, it would seem, were quite instrumental. Here the police are also mentioned. We've got plenty of evidence and information for the groups that come from the reports, for the groups that were particularly responsible for carrying out and implementing the pogrom. Something else that also comes out from the reports is the sheer geographical spread across Germany and Austria of the attacks of Kristallnacht. Often towns and cities are named. There are a lot of reports from places like Vienna and Munich and Berlin, as you'd expect, but there are reports from all over. And B35, which I think is somewhere over here, but it actually is interesting because of the scale of the settlements being smaller, indicating that even in quite remote rural areas you would not necessarily be safe from attack. So in report 35 they talk about a smallish town of 30,000, a village of 700, and even a remote Jewish farm which was attacked during Kristallnacht. So it gives an idea of how widespread the violence was. Another thing drawn out by some of the testimonies is the fact that there were kind of organised groups of bystanders, in a sense, to the events that went on. So even though we saw evidence in the previous testimony that the police had sometimes been involved, in the main, the police had actually been ordered to stand back. And so in the main, the police acted to just allow events to happen. And so did the fire brigade. So as I'm sure you're aware, an important aspect of Kristallnacht was that synagogues and sometimes other buildings were burnt, and the fire brigade in the main, with the occasional exception, did not intervene, and they had been told not to intervene. They did sometimes act, as in this case, to protect other buildings, but not things like synagogues. A number of reports, interestingly often from Munich actually, also record solidarity from some of what is usually referred to as either the Aryan or the Christian population in Germany. So as I say, this is something I noticed in a number of reports from Munich, as it happens. So a person who had actually experienced firsthand the events, and I think this came from a letter they'd managed to post to Holland, said, "The mood amongst the Christian population of Munich is thoroughly against the operation. I was shown the liveliest sympathy and compassion from all sides." So there is evidence of collaboration, of people participating in the attacks who weren't necessarily fully committed Nazis, but equally there is some evidence of solidarity, at least in some places, and a lot of evidence of people not taking action, as in the fire brigades as well. I just wanted to finish by looking at this report, because these reports are incredibly useful as historical evidence, but also I think shouldn't be forgotten as a kind of testimony to the suffering of people that, Jews that were in Germany and Austria at the time. So this report B35, we have only reported facts here. We are unable to depict the horror and the fear which has overcome the people involved. Sorrow at the destruction of holy places, the loss of so many valuables and of existence are accepted in silence. Only fearful worry for the lives of their relatives dominates these people. And I think in terms of as testimony to the effect on people's lives and state of mind, that's a very powerful document, and where I am going to leave it